The first time my brother-in-law called me a fraud in public, a retired general was standing 10 feet behind him with one hand resting on the shoulder of a young woman whose father had died in a helicopter crash. I had spent 17 years trying to understand. Mason Vale did not see either of them. He was too busy enjoying the room. He stood beneath a blue and gold banner at the Army Aviation Heritage Banquet, one hand around a champagne glass and the other pointing at the ribbons on my uniform. His smile was bright enough for the cameras and cold enough for me. "Tell them the truth, Claire," he said. "Tell all these officers what you really did. Tell them you counted bolts in a warehouse while other people flew into danger." The ballroom went still. My sister Ellen stared at the tablecloth. My husband Tom reached for my hand. The president of Mason's company stopped smiling. 3 colonels near the stage turned slowly in their chairs. Mason mistook the silence for victory. Then the retired general behind him spoke. He asked me one question. "Does the name Copper Ridge mean anything to you, Chief Mercer?" I looked at him and felt a door open inside me that had been locked for almost 2 decades. "Yes, sir," I said. "What was your call sign?" "Rook." The young woman beside him covered her mouth. Mason lowered his glass. Across the room, 2 federal investigators stepped away from the wall and began walking toward the stage. The general did not look at me again. He looked at Mason. "Your company built its entire safety system from her Copper Ridge report," he said. "You removed the warning she wrote in the first paragraph. Then you sold the dangerous version back to the Army. That was the first shock. The second came when the young woman opened the leather folder in her hands and placed her father's original maintenance notebook on the table. The third came when one of the investigators told Mason that his contract had been suspended before dessert was served. If silence has ever been mistaken for weakness in your life, stay with me and tell me in the comments where you are listening from. Because what happened in that ballroom began 4 months earlier at my mother's Thanksgiving table with a brass key, a glossy brochure, and one sentence Mason should never have printed. I was 58 that fall. I had been retired from active duty for 6 years, though retired is a generous word for anyone who has spent most of her adult life around military aircraft. The Army still called when a vibration pattern did not make sense. A depot commander still sent me photographs of cracked housings and asked what I saw. I worked 3 days a week as a civilian aviation safety auditor outside Huntsville, Alabama, and spent the other 4 pretending I knew how to relax. Tom said I relaxed like a sentry. He was not wrong. We had been married for 31 years. He was a middle school principal with a patient face, a dry sense of humor, and the rare ability to sit beside a locked door without rattling the handle. He knew there were parts of my military service I could not discuss. He never treated that boundary like a personal rejection. He simply made coffee, kept the porch light on, and waited for me to come home from whatever version of the world had borrowed me. My younger sister Ellen had married Mason 12 years earlier. Mason had flown medevac helicopters in the National Guard before a back injury moved him out of the cockpit. He told the story as if the Army had begged him to stay and the human spine had personally betrayed the nation. After leaving uniform, he joined a defense contractor called Aegis Flight Systems. By the time of that Thanksgiving, he was Senior Vice President for Business Development, which meant he shook hands, made promises, and let engineers lose sleep over both. Mason was not a coward. That would have been easier. He had flown in bad weather. He had brought wounded soldiers home. He had earned respect honestly once, and I think that made what came later more dangerous. A man who has never earned respect knows he is pretending. A man who earned it years ago can convince himself that every shortcut afterward is merely collecting interest. My mother, Ruth, lived in the same brick ranch outside Decatur where Ellen and I had grown up. The carpet was older than some of the lieutenants I had trained. The kitchen clock ran 6 minutes fast. My father had been gone 9 years, but his coffee mug still sat on the second shelf because my mother believed grief should have a place setting. Thanksgiving began normally. Turkey, sweet potatoes, Ellen correcting our mother about salt, Tom helping my nephew Jonah repair a train set on the living room floor, Mason arriving late in a black sport utility vehicle that cost more than my first house. He carried a stack of glossy brochures under one arm. I saw the company logo before he cleared the doorway. Aegis Flight Systems, Vigilant Rotor Health Monitor. Mason kissed my mother, handed Ellen a bottle of wine, and laid the brochures beside the dinner rolls as if they were family photographs. "Big month," he announced. "We are finalists for the Army Fleet Modernization Award." My mother clapped because she clapped for all of us, whether we announced a promotion or successfully changed a furnace filter. How big? Tom asked. Mason waited half a beat. He always liked people to lean toward the answer. $42 million in the first phase, he said. More if the system goes fleet-wide. Ellen smiled, but I saw the tightness at the corner of her mouth. They had refinanced their home twice. Mason had bought a lake house the previous spring and called it an investment, though everyone knew investments rarely came with a fishing dock and a cedar sauna. He passed the brochures around. The Vigilant system was supposed to detect dangerous vibration changes in helicopter rotor assemblies before a failure occurred. The brochure showed a clean digital display with 3 colored arcs and a line of copy beneath it. 3 tones, 1 truth. Know before you fly. My fingers stopped on the page. Tom noticed. He always noticed. The phrase came from a field procedure developed at Copper Ridge, not the marketing language. The sequence beneath it, low frequency first, harmonic comparison second, heat drift last, 3 tones, 1 truth. It was the kind of plain language mechanics used when engines were running, dust was blowing, and nobody had time for a lecture. I had written it on a piece of cardboard with a grease pencil 17 years earlier. Staff Sergeant Noah Bell had taped that cardboard above a maintenance bench. Noah had died 11 days later. I looked farther down the brochure. There it was. A small diagram of a crescent-shaped mark beside a bearing housing. In our field notes, the mark had been red chalk. It told a mechanic that the sensor reading could not be trusted until the housing temperature dropped below a safe threshold. In Mason's brochure, the red chalk crescent had become a company logo flourish. The warning was gone. Where did your engineers get this test sequence? I asked. Mason was carving turkey. He did not look up. Research, he said. Years of it. Whose research? He smiled at the bird as if it had asked the question. That is proprietary, Claire. I turned the brochure over. A serial number had been printed near the bottom for the demonstration unit. My mother called everyone to the table. Chairs scraped, plates moved. The conversation shifted to football, Jonah's college applications, and whether the pecan pie needed another 10 minutes. I slipped the brochure into my purse. As I did, something small struck the hardwood floor beside Mason's chair. A brass key. He bent quickly and picked it up, but not before I saw the flattened oval head and the shallow notch near the tip. It belonged to my father's old field trunk. The trunk sat in my mother's basement beneath a stack of Christmas decorations. My father had used it during his own Army years, and after he died, I had stored a sealed packet inside it. The packet contained declassified portions of my Copper Ridge investigation, personal copies I was permitted to keep, along with Noah Bell's duplicate maintenance diagrams. The classified annexes were elsewhere. The dangerous part was not classified. The dangerous part was simply technical enough that most people would not know what they were seeing. Mason noticed me looking at the key. Found it in a junk drawer downstairs, he said. My mother frowned. I do not keep keys in junk drawers. He laughed and tucked it into his pocket. You keep everything in junk drawers, Ruth. The family laughed. My mother did not. That was the first thread. The second came during dinner. Mason described the Vigilant system with the confidence of a man who had not built it but had learned which words impressed people. Predictive maintenance, machine learning, fleet readiness, lives saved before a warning light ever appeared. Then he turned toward me. Claire understands inventory, he said. Maybe she can explain how hard it is to keep track of all those little parts. Ellen looked down. Tom set his fork beside his plate. I had heard versions of that joke for years. Mason knew I had worked in aviation safety. He also knew much of my record was redacted and that I rarely corrected people. Somewhere along the way, he had decided my silence meant the most boring explanation must be true. I counted parts sometimes, I said. Mason raised his glass. See? Honest work. Nothing wrong with it. Nothing at all, I said. He wanted me embarrassed. Instead, I asked him one more question. Did your final hot weather test include a full cooldown cycle between harmonic readings? His carving knife paused. It was less than a second. Nobody else noticed. Then he smiled. Our engineers handled the testing. That was not my question. He leaned back. You have been out of the game a long time, Claire. I folded my napkin. Not that long. The conversation moved on, but Mason watched me twice during dessert. The second time, his thumb rubbed the pocket where he had placed the brass key. When Tom and I left, The air outside had turned sharp. He carried the pie my mother had forced on us. I carried my purse with the brochure inside. In the truck, he did not start the engine right away. You know that system, he said. I looked through the windshield at my mother's porch light. I know the bones of it. Did he take something from the trunk? I do not know yet. Tom rested both hands on the steering wheel. Are you going to tell Ellen? Not yet. He nodded. He did not like the answer, but he understood it. What are you going to do? I opened my purse and looked again at the serial number on the brochure. The same thing I always did when an aircraft told me two different stories. Listen to both until one of them broke. The following Monday, I drove to the aviation depot before sunrise. The hangars were still mostly dark, long gray shapes beneath a pale sky. I liked that hour. Machines had no interest in hierarchy before breakfast. A gearbox did not care who had the larger office. A cracked race did not salute rank. Metal told the truth if you knew how to ask without forcing an answer. My office was a converted storage room with one narrow window and two filing cabinets that had survived at least 3 reorganizations. I closed the door, set the brochure on my desk, and wrote the demonstration serial number on a yellow legal pad. Then, I did nothing for 5 minutes. That pause mattered. People imagine investigations begin with action. Most good ones begin with restraint. You separate what you know from what you suspect. You write down your own assumptions before they have time to disguise themselves as facts. What I knew was simple. Mason possessed a key to my father's trunk. His company brochure contained a test sequence and visual mark taken from the Copper Ridge field procedure. The brochure omitted the most important limitation. Mason had avoided a direct question about hot weather testing. What I suspected was worse. I called Dana Cho, a government contracts attorney I had worked with on a rotor blade case 3 years earlier. Dana had a voice that could make a grocery list sound admissible in federal court. I told her I had encountered vendor material outside work that might contain improperly obtained technical information. I did not name Mason at first. Are you on the source selection team? She asked. No. Do you have access to the competing proposals? No. Have you shared any non-public government information with the vendor? Absolutely not. Good, she said. Then do not touch their proposal. Preserve what came to you naturally. Write a dated memorandum. Photograph the brochure. Do not search restricted systems out of curiosity. And Claire, yes. If family is involved, assume every future conversation may be replayed by someone who does not love you. That was Dana's expensive way of saying, do not get clever. I followed her advice. I photographed every page of the brochure. I placed the original in a clear evidence sleeve. I wrote down the Thanksgiving conversation word for word as best I could. Then I contacted the Defense Department Inspector General hotline through the secure reporting channel available to civilian employees. The law in plain English is not complicated. A company that knowingly lies to obtain federal money can face civil penalties, repayment, and exclusion from future contracts. A contracting officer does not need to wait for a criminal conviction before stopping work when safety or responsibility is in serious doubt. That power exists because soldiers should not have to become evidence before the government acts. By noon, I received a reply asking for a confidential interview. I did not tell Tom that night. Not because I distrusted him, because once he knew, every family dinner would become an acting exercise, and Tom had many gifts, but a convincing poker face was not among them. Instead, I asked him whether the basement window at my mother's house had ever been repaired after the spring storm. He looked up from the newspaper. That is a very specific question. I am a specific woman. It still sticks, he said. Why? No reason yet. He studied me over his reading glasses. That sentence has never once meant no reason. 2 days later, I met Special Agent Marisol Vega in a conference room with no decorations and a camera mounted high in one corner. She worked procurement fraud for the Inspector General. She was in her early 40s, compact, direct, and patient in the way only experienced investigators are patient. She did not interrupt. She let silence make room for details. When I finished, she asked about Copper Ridge. I gave her the unclassified history. 17 years earlier, I had been a chief warrant officer assigned to an aviation safety cell supporting a special operations task force. Our crews were flying in heat, dust, and high terrain, conditions that punish small maintenance errors. A pattern emerged in one helicopter model. Pilots reported a faint change in vibration during climb. Standard diagnostics often showed nothing. Bearings came back with intolerance. Flights continued. Noah Bell heard the change before the instruments agreed. He was a crew chief from Kentucky, with a slow smile and a habit of tapping 3 times on any housing he inspected. He said machines spoke in rhythm before they spoke in numbers. I told him that sounded like superstition. He told me most science began as superstition, with better paperwork. Together, we developed a field comparison using 3 readings: low frequency, harmonic shift, heat drift. If all 3 moved in a certain relationship, the aircraft remained grounded even when each individual reading appeared acceptable. The red chalk crescent marked a reading taken above the temperature threshold. It meant wait, cool the housing, and test again. During the Copper Ridge operation, our procedure kept 2 aircraft on the ground. One of them later showed a hidden defect that could have caused catastrophic failure. The 3rd aircraft had been tested by another team. Their sensor data looked clean. The red chalk warning was not recorded. It crashed during a night approach. Noah Bell was aboard, so were 4 others. The formal investigation found multiple contributing factors. The field procedure was adopted in a limited form, then folded into broader diagnostics. Parts of the report remained restricted because of the unit and location. My name disappeared beneath office symbols, review stamps, and language written to protect operations still underway. That had never bothered me. Noah's daughter had been 11. Her name was Lily. I had not seen her since the memorial. Agent Vega listened without moving. "Who possessed your personal copy?" she asked. "I did." "Who had access to the trunk?" "My mother. My sister. Possibly Mason. Why keep the documents there?" "My house flooded 6 years ago. I moved family records temporarily. Then temporary became ordinary." "Did the packet include the heat limitation?" "Yes. On the first page. In plain language." She turned the brochure toward herself. "This product language copies your sequence but omits that limitation. That is what concerns me." She looked at the serial number. "We will obtain the test records through proper channels. You will not." "Understood." "Do not confront your brother-in-law." I almost smiled. "I was not planning to. Most people say that," she replied. "Then they invite the suspect to lunch. I do not like lunch enough to compromise an investigation." For the first time, she smiled. "Good. One more thing. If he obtained those papers, he may believe the missing classified annexes contain additional proof he needs. He may come looking." That thought stayed with me on the drive home. At my mother's house the next Saturday, I went to the basement under the excuse of finding her artificial wreath. The field trunk sat where I had left it, but the dust on the lid had been disturbed. The lock showed no damage. Mason had not forced it. He had used the key. Inside, the sealed packet was still there. At first glance, nothing was missing. Then I noticed the order of the pages. My father had taught us to align every packet with the folded edge facing left. It was an old habit from handling maps. The Copper Ridge pages faced right. Someone had removed them, copied them, and put them back. Beneath the packet lay a strip of transparent tape with a single dark fiber caught under it. Expensive charcoal wool. Mason had worn a charcoal wool coat to my mother's birthday dinner the previous winter. I did not touch the fiber. I photographed it, closed the trunk, and called Agent Vega from my car. She asked whether the room had a camera. No. Whether my mother would consent to a search? Probably, but it would alert Ellen. Then leave it. The papers are not classified, and the key is not proof of copying by itself. We will build the case from records the company cannot explain away. That answer frustrated me because it was correct. Investigations are often less satisfying than television. Evidence does not arrive in a single shining piece. It accumulates like dust. One layer means nothing. 10 layers reveal where someone has walked. The first public crack in Mason's story came at a church supper in January. My mother volunteered at a veterans food pantry run from the fellowship hall of an old Methodist church. Once a year, the pantry held a fundraiser with chili, cornbread, and enough sheet cake to support a small battalion. Mason attended because the local newspaper was there. Aegis had donated new freezers, and his company name appeared on a banner behind the serving line. Tom and I went because my mother threatened to drive herself after dark if we did not. Near the dessert table sat retired Brigadier General Elias Boone. I had not seen him in 14 years. Time had narrowed him but not diminished him. His hair was white, his shoulders had softened. His eyes remained exactly the same, calm, level, and difficult to fool. General Boone had commanded the aviation task force during Copper Ridge. He had signed the order grounding those two aircraft over the objections of officers who worried about mission schedules. When the defect was found, he never claimed credit. When the third aircraft crashed, he stood beside every family at the memorial and remembered every name without notes. I saw him before he saw me. My first instinct was to leave. Not from shame, from the old reflex of keeping sealed worlds apart. Then my mother called across the room, "Claire, bring General Boone some coffee." His head turned. For a moment, he looked through me. Then, recognition reached his face slowly, not as surprise, but as memory returning to its proper place. "Chief Mercer," he said. The room around us did not change. People kept eating chili. Children chased each other between folding chairs. A volunteer dropped a stack of plastic forks. But Mason, standing beside the newspaper photographer, heard the title. I carried the coffee over. "Sir." Boone took the cup, but did not drink. "I heard you retired before the Army figured out how much trouble that would cause. It has survived. Barely, I imagine." He smiled, then lowered his voice. "Rook." The call sign had begun as a joke. During a training exercise, I had moved maintenance crews and spare aircraft around a map until a colonel said I treated helicopters like chess pieces. Noah heard him and started calling me Rook because, he said, I moved straight and hit hard. Mason approached before I could redirect the conversation. "General Boone," he said, extending his hand. "Mason Vale, former medevac pilot, Aegis Flight Systems." Boone shook his hand politely. "I know the company. We are doing exciting work in predictive rotor safety." "So, I hear." Mason glanced at me. "Claire never mentioned she knew you." Boone looked from him to me. "Claire has never mentioned most of what she has done." The photographer lowered his camera, sensing a better story than a freezer donation. Mason laughed. "She is modest about warehouse work." Boone's expression did not change, but the warmth left his eyes. Chief Mercer was not a warehouse clerk. I could have stopped him. I almost did. Then he said only this: "There are pilots alive because she knew when not to let them fly." Mason's smile remained in place. Everything behind it shifted. He recovered quickly and began talking about the vigilance system. Boone listened without interruption. When Mason repeated the phrase, "3 tones, 1 truth," the general's gaze moved to me. He knew. Not everything, but enough. After Mason walked away, Boone set his untouched coffee on the table. "Did you authorize that language?" he asked. "No." "Does the Inspector General know?" I looked at him. That was answer enough. He nodded once. "Then I will know nothing until someone asks me properly." That was the old code. Do not gossip, do not interfere, be ready to testify. Before we parted, he asked whether I had spoken to Lily Bell. "No, she is an engineer now," he said. "Works in vibration analysis. Noah would have enjoyed that." The news struck me with an ache so precise it felt almost clean. "Does she know about the system?" Boone's eyes moved toward Mason across the room. "She knows someone has been using her father's diagrams." That was the third thread. On the drive home, Tom kept both hands on the wheel. "You were called Rook," he said. "Yes, you never told me." I looked out at the dark fields beyond the highway. It never seemed important at home. He was quiet for a mile. Then he said, "I would like to know the unimportant things too, when you can tell me." There was no accusation in it. That made the sentence harder. I reached across the console and put my hand over his. "I will try." Neither of us noticed the black vehicle 2 cars behind us until it followed through 3 turns and then disappeared when we entered our neighborhood. The black vehicle returned 3 days later. This time it parked across from the depot gate while I left work. The driver wore sunglasses despite the rain. He did not follow me home. He only lifted a phone and took my photograph. I wrote down the license plate and called Agent Vega. She ran it while I waited. The vehicle belonged to a private investigations firm in Birmingham. Aegis Flight Systems had hired the firm 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. "He is checking your background," Vega said. "He will not find much." That may be the point. Empty spaces frighten people who live by leverage. Mason called that evening. His tone was friendly enough to make my shoulders tighten. Ellen says you and the general had quite a reunion, he said. We knew each other. From Copper Ridge? He said the name carefully. I did not answer. He continued. Funny thing, I asked around. There is no public record of you at Copper Ridge. No award citation, no deployment roster, nothing. Then perhaps you should stop asking. He laughed. You always do that. You hide behind silence and let people imagine something impressive. What do you want, Mason? I want clarity. Aegis is competing for a major contract. I cannot have a relative spreading rumors that our work is stolen. I have spread no rumors. Boone knew the phrase. General Boone knows many things. Did you give him our brochure? No. Did you contact the Army about us? I looked at the kitchen doorway. Tom stood there, listening to one side of the conversation. Mason, I said, if your system is safe and your records are honest, questions will not hurt you. The friendliness vanished. That sounded like a threat. It sounded like maintenance advice. He ended the call. Tom leaned against the doorway. How bad is it? I had reached the point where withholding everything would place him at greater risk than sharing part of the truth. I told him the product resembled the Copper Ridge procedure. I told him I had made a protected report. I told him not to discuss it with Ellen, my mother, or anyone else. He listened, then asked the question I had been avoiding. Could that system kill someone? If the hot weather limitation is missing, yes. His face changed. Tom had spent his career around children. Danger became real to him when it had a name and a family waiting at home. Does Ellen know? I do not think so. Could Mason know? That is what they are investigating. Tom sat at the kitchen table. I want to believe he is arrogant, not evil. So do I. There is a difference. There is also a distance between them, I said. People cross it one excuse at a time. The investigation moved quietly through February. Agent Vega obtained internal Aegis test reports through a government demand. A laboratory in Arizona had conducted the environmental trials. The official summary claimed the system performed correctly through extreme heat cycles. The raw data told another story. On 3 tests, the harmonic alarm had disappeared after the sensor housing exceeded its reliable temperature range. Instead of recording an invalid reading, someone changed the software flag from caution to pass. The user credentials belonged to a junior engineer named Priya Nanduri. Priya denied making the changes. Her supervisor produced a signed certification bearing her electronic signature. She said the signature was copied. Aegis placed her on administrative leave for poor performance. That was when Priya contacted me. She did not call my office. She waited outside a grocery store near my home on a Thursday evening, standing beside a dented sedan with both hands wrapped around a paper cup. I recognized fear before I recognized her face. Chief Mercer, she said when I approached. Who are you? Priya Nanduri. I work for Aegis. Or, I did this morning. I looked around the parking lot. How did you find me? Mason has a file on you. Your address is in it. That answer chilled me more than the wind. You should not be here. I did not know who else to trust. She opened the rear door of her car and took out a small cardboard box. Inside were printed emails, meeting notes, and a black external drive. I did not touch them. You need an attorney, I said. Then you need the inspector general. They will say, I stole company property. Maybe. That does not mean you should hand it to me in a parking lot. Tears gathered in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. They changed my data. I told Mason the heat drift made the alarm unreliable. He said the Army would never approve a system that required a cool-down pause. He said pilots wanted certainty, not caveats. Did you document that? She pointed to the box. He told me to revise the summary. I refused. 2 days later, the summary changed under my login. I took out my phone and called Agent Vega. While we waited, Priya told me the part that made the case personal. Mason had shown the engineering team scanned pages from the Copper Ridge report. The first page included the heat warning. He instructed them to remove it from all customer materials. Why? I asked, though I knew. Because the contract required a system that gave an answer within 4 minutes. A proper cooldown could take 20. There it was. Not ignorance, not oversight. A business requirement placed above a physical limit. Machines do not negotiate with deadlines. Heat does not care about a sales target. A bearing does not become safe because an executive promised a delivery date. Agent Vega arrived with another investigator. They photographed the box before moving it. They gave Priya written instructions, arranged counsel, and took a formal statement. Before she left, Priya turned to me. "There is more," she said. "What more?" Mason told the board the procedure belonged to him. He said he developed it while flying medevac missions. I felt no surprise, only a tired sadness. Did anyone question him? One person did. A woman named Lily Bell. The parking lot noise seemed to recede. "Lily works for Aegis," Priya continued. "She joined last summer. When she saw her father's handwriting in the scanned notebook, she confronted Mason. He moved her off the project and threatened to sue her for taking proprietary material. Where is she now? Still there. He made her sign a non-disclosure agreement. An agreement cannot lawfully hide fraud from the government," Agent Vega said. "But many employees do not know that until fear has done its work." Priya left with the investigators. I sat in my truck for a long time. Noah's daughter had walked into a company conference room and seen her dead father's handwriting being presented as Mason's invention. I imagined her recognizing the slant of his letters, the small open top on his fours, the way he underlined any word he considered dangerous. I had carried guilt about Noah for 17 years. Not rational guilt, the stubborn kind. The kind that survives every report and every official finding, because grief does not read conclusions. Now his work had been stolen too. When I reached home, Tom had left soup warming on the stove. He found me standing in the dark kitchen without removing my coat. He did not ask what happened. He put both arms around me. For a while, I let him. The next morning, Ellen called. Her voice shook with anger. "What are you doing to Mason?" I stood beside my office window, watching rain thread down the glass. "What did he tell you?" "That you filed a complaint to ruin the contract. That you are jealous because he took an old maintenance idea and turned it into something useful." "An old maintenance idea." "Do not twist my words, Claire. Did he tell you where he found it?" "He said Dad gave him access to military papers before he died. Our father had been unconscious for the final 6 days of his life. Mason had visited once for 20 minutes. Ellen knew that. I heard her breathing on the line. "He says you never did what people think you did," she continued. "He says your record is empty because there is nothing there. My record is not the issue. It is when you use it to frighten people." I closed my eyes. "Ellen, ask him one question. Ask whether his engineers warned him the sensor failed when the housing stayed hot." She went silent. "Ask him in a room where he cannot walk away." "You are trying to break my marriage." "No. I am trying to keep a pilot's marriage from ending at a memorial service." She hung up. That sentence cost me my sister for nearly 3 months. My mother stopped inviting both couples to the same meal. Jonah withdrew from a summer internship at Aegis without telling his father why. Tom received an anonymous complaint at his school accusing him of using his position to spread false claims about a local business leader. The complaint was dismissed, but it served its purpose. Mason wanted us to know he could reach into ordinary life. Then my own supervisor called me into his office. Aegis had accused me of a conflict of interest and theft of proprietary information. I was temporarily removed from any work touching rotor monitoring systems while counsel reviewed the allegation. I had expected retaliation. Expecting a blow does not make it painless. I cleared my desk under the eyes of coworkers who had not been told why. One of them offered to carry my box. I declined because pride is foolish but persistent. In the parking lot, I found a folded note beneath my windshield wiper. Rook should have stayed on the chessboard. No signature. No need. I placed the note in an evidence sleeve and called Agent Vega. That evening, Mason came to my house. Tom opened the door but did not invite him in. Mason looked tired, not remorseful. Tired in the way a man looks when maintaining too many lies has become physical labor. "I need 5 minutes with Claire," he said. "You can have them on the porch," Tom replied. I stepped outside. Mason held a thick folder against his chest. "You should withdraw the complaint," he said. "I cannot withdraw facts. You can say you were mistaken. Were the hot test flags changed?" He looked past me toward the living room window. "You do not understand the commercial side." That was an answer. He opened the folder. Inside were copies of my service records. Most pages contained black blocks where units, dates, and duties had been removed. "I have spent weeks on this," he said. "There is no proof you led anything. No proof you created that procedure. Your name is not on the patent. Your name is not in the public report. There is no patent. Exactly. The Army owns the work, Mason. Noah helped create it. I documented it. General Boone approved it. None of us owned it privately. Then nobody stole it. Using an Army procedure is not the theft I reported. His eyes narrowed. What did you report? False testing. Removed warnings. Misrepresented authorship. Retaliation against engineers. For the first time, fear showed clearly on his face. You have no access to our testing. I did not say I did. Who talked? I said nothing. He stepped closer. Claire, listen to me. If this contract dies, Aegis collapses. 400 people lose jobs. Ellen loses the house. Jonah loses tuition. My entire compensation for 5 years is tied to this award. I used every asset we had to buy company shares before the final round. There was the number beneath his panic. He had borrowed against the lake house, their home, and Ellen's retirement account. His personal exposure was more than $3 million. The company had a credit line due in 60 days. Without the Army award, the bank could call the debt. You risked your family on a system you knew was unsafe, I said. I risked everything on making it safe enough. Safe enough is not a maintenance standard. Do you think every piece of equipment is perfect? Do you think the Army waits for perfect? No. The Army waits for honest limitations. He lowered his voice. You could help me fix this quietly. How? Tell the investigators the heat warning was ocminal. Say the field procedure was never validated. Say Boone misunderstood your role. He was asking me to erase Noah a second time. I looked at the man my sister had loved for 12 years and finally understood that his greatest fear was not prison or bankruptcy. It was becoming ordinary. If the contract vanished, he would no longer be the visionary executive, the decorated pilot, the family success story. He would be a middle-aged man with debt, a bad back, and a history that no longer guaranteed applause. I cannot help you lie, I said. His face hardened. Then I will make sure everyone knows you are the liar. He walked down the steps and turned at the sidewalk. There is an aviation banquet in April, he said. Aegis is presenting the Vigilance system. Half the acquisition command will be there. Bring your uniform. Let us see whose story they believe. Tom came out after Mason drove away. He stood beside me beneath the porch light. You are not going, he said. Yes, I am. Claire, he built the stage because he thinks truth is a performance. Tom looked toward the empty street. And what do you think? I folded the threatening note inside its evidence sleeve. I think truth is a weight. He has been carrying it badly. I am going to let him set it down in front of everyone. The invitation arrived 1 week later on heavy cream paper. The Army Aviation Heritage Banquet would be held at a hotel in Huntsville. Aegis Flight Systems was the principal sponsor. Mason was listed as the featured industry speaker. Beneath his name appeared the title of his presentation, The Future of Predictive Safety. I handed the invitation to Agent Vega during our next meeting. She read it, then looked at me. He invited you. He wants a public denial. Are you planning to give him one? I am planning to eat the chicken and behave myself. She did not smile. The procurement office expects to make an award recommendation within days of the banquet. We are trying to complete enough review to support a suspension before then. Until that happens, you cannot reveal the investigation. Understood, even if he provokes you, especially then. She slid the invitation back across the table. There may be another reason he wants you in the room. His attorneys believe the copied procedure is public domain because portions of the report were declassified. If you react emotionally and claim personal ownership, they can portray the dispute as a family grievance. So, he wants me angry. He wants you inaccurate. That distinction stayed with me. Anger was not the danger. Inaccuracy was. Dana Cho joined us by secure video and explained the legal line again. The government could use unclassified technical methods when properly obtained. The problem was not that Aegis had seen an old procedure. The problem was that company leaders allegedly concealed known limitations, falsified testing, lied about origin to investors and officials, and punished employees who objected. Facts, Dana said, do not become private property because someone prints them on expensive paper. Fraud does not become innovation because someone adds a logo. I wrote that sentence down. A week before the banquet, Lily Bell called me. Her voice sounded older than the girl I remembered and younger than the burden she carried. Chief Mercer, she said. General Boone gave me your number. Please call me Claire. I do not think I can. Noah had been the same way. He called me Chief, even while arguing that my coffee could dissolve a wrench. We met at a quiet diner near the Tennessee River. Lily arrived with a leather folder and her father's maintenance notebook, wrapped in a clean dish towel. I recognized the notebook before she uncovered it. Green canvas, frayed corner, a dark thumbprint near the spine that no amount of handling had erased. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. She placed it between us. "Mom kept this in a cedar chest," she said. "I started reading it in high school. Most of it made no sense then. By college, it made too much sense." Lily was 30 now. She had become a mechanical engineer, then specialized in vibration analysis because, in her words, she wanted to understand the language that had taken her father away. Last summer, Aegis recruited her from a turbine manufacturer. Mason personally interviewed her. "Did he know who your father was?" I asked. "Not at first. I used my married name on the application. Bell was my middle name in the personnel file. When he showed us the Copper Ridge scans, I recognized Dad's handwriting. I told him the notebook belonged to my family." "What did he say?" "He said grief can make people see ownership where there is only coincidence." My hands tightened beneath the table. Lily continued. "I brought him this notebook the next day. I showed him matching diagrams. He offered me a promotion if I signed a statement saying my father had copied the method from a medevac training course Mason taught years later, and when you refused, he moved me to documentation review. Then legal sent a letter saying the company would sue if I disclosed trade secrets." She opened the folder. Inside were copies of emails and a photograph of Mason standing in the conference room beside a projected image of Noah's diagram. "The investigators have all of this," she said. "I met Agent Vega yesterday." "Good." Lily looked down at the notebook. "I used to blame you." The sentence did not surprise me. I had blamed myself, too. "For the crash," she said. "Mom told me you grounded 2 aircraft, but not Dad's. I thought that meant you chose which crews mattered." I let the words sit. Defending myself too quickly would have served my comfort, not hers. "Your father's aircraft was tested by another team before our procedure became mandatory," I said. "I argued to retest every aircraft. The mission commander approved only the 2 with the clearest warning signs. I did not have authority to ground the 3rd on my own. Did you know it was unsafe?" I knew I was not satisfied. "That is not the same answer." "No, it is not." She raised her eyes. "Would you have stopped him if you could?" I thought of Noah tapping the housing 3 times. I thought of his grin when he proved an instrument wrong. I thought of the memorial, Lily standing beside her mother in a black dress with sleeves too long for her arms. I would have chained myself to the landing gear. Her mouth trembled. "For 17 years," I said, "I have wished I had found a way to make one more person listen." Lily reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "Then maybe we make them listen now." That was the moment the investigation stopped feeling like a case I had reported and became a promise. We spent 2 hours going through Noah's notebook. The heat warning appeared 9 times. He had underlined one sentence so heavily the pen tore the page. "Hot metal tells pretty lies." Mason's engineers had received scans of every page except that one. The missing page was not missing from my packet. It had been omitted deliberately from the files circulated inside Aegis. Lily had another piece of evidence. At a board meeting in December, Mason presented projected savings from removing the cool-down requirement. The shorter tests would reduce maintenance delays enough to help Aegis meet the Army's readiness target. He described the heat warning as an outdated field superstition. The board minutes recorded the phrase, "Lily had been assigned to prepare the minutes." She kept the original version before Mason's assistant revised it. Agent Vega called me that evening. "We now have knowledge, motive, and concealment," she said. "We still need to tie Mason personally to the altered test certifications." Priya said he ordered the change. Her testimony matters. A record matters more. "What are you looking for?" "An approval trail, a message, a file history, something his attorneys cannot call misunderstanding." The answer arrived from Mason himself. 3 nights before the banquet, Ellen came to our house. She looked as if she had not slept in a week. Her hair was pulled back without care. She carried Mason's old leather briefcase. Tom let her in and quietly went upstairs. Ellen placed the briefcase on my kitchen table. "I asked him the question," she said. "Which question?" "Whether the engineers warned him about the heat." I waited. He said all technology has limitations. I asked whether he changed the reports. He told me spouses who enjoy nice homes should not ask how contracts are won. The cruelty of that answer seemed to surprise her more than the admission. She opened the briefcase. Inside was a company laptop, a small recording device, and a bundle of documents. "I cannot take these," I said. "I know. I called the number you gave Mom for the Inspector General. They told me not to open anything and to bring it directly to them. I wanted you to see the briefcase first." "Why?" She touched a scratch near the brass latch. "Because it was Dad's." I looked closer. My father had carried that briefcase during his final years at the rail yard. After he died, Ellen believed it had been donated with his work clothes. Mason had kept it. She lifted the inner flap. Taped beneath it was a flattened oval brass key, the twin to the key from Thanksgiving. "Dad had 2 copies," Ellen said. "Mason told me he found one in a junk drawer. He had both." For the first time since our angry phone call, my sister looked directly at me. He went into the trunk. "Claire." I found scans on the laptop screen. "Your report." Noah's notebook. He had a folder labeled Rook. I did not ask how she accessed the computer. Agent Vega would handle that question. Ellen took a breath. "There is an audio file, too." Mason recorded a meeting with the software team because he records everything. I heard him tell Priya to change the heat failures to passes. He said no general was going to delay $42 million over a 20-minute cooldown. The room seemed to settle around us. There was the record. There was the sentence. There was the hand on the switch. "Why did you bring it?" I asked. Ellen's eyes filled. "Because I kept telling myself he was protecting our family. Then I realized he was using our family as a reason to endanger someone else's." I moved around the table and held her. She cried against my shoulder with the broken exhaustion of someone whose marriage had collapsed before the furniture moved. "I am sorry," she said. "I am so sorry I believed him. You believed your husband. I chose not to believe my sister. Both can be true." Agent Vega arrived with a warrant team less than an hour later. Ellen gave a statement. The investigators took custody of the briefcase and laptop. They photographed the key where it lay. They did not turn on the computer in our house. Digital evidence has rules. You do not browse through it like family photographs. You preserve it, document who handled it, and make a forensic copy so the original remains unchanged. Before Vega left, she pulled me aside. "We have enough to request immediate suspension," she said. "The contracting officer is reviewing it tonight. Will it happen before the banquet? I cannot promise timing. Does Mason know Ellen came here?" "Not yet. He did by morning." At 6:15, my phone filled with messages. Some were from Mason, some from his attorney. One was from the president of Aegis demanding the return of stolen company property. Another threatened action against Ellen for breach of confidentiality. I forwarded everything to Vega without replying. At 7, my mother called. Mason had appeared at her house before dawn, pounding on the door and demanding to search the basement. She refused to let him inside. When he shouted that Claire was destroying 400 families, my mother told him something I wish I had heard in person. A man does not get to hide behind 400 families after risking 400 sons and daughters. Then she locked the door. By noon, Aegis placed Mason on temporary leave, but the company did not cancel his banquet speech. Their board hoped the scandal could still be contained. Mason's attorney advised him to stay home. Mason ignored him. That was his final mistake before the ballroom. The night of the banquet, I stood in front of our bedroom mirror wearing my Army dress uniform for the first time in years. The jacket fit more tightly across the shoulders. The silver insignia caught the lamplight. My ribbons formed a small, orderly history that revealed less than people assumed and more than I usually wished to explain. Tom stood behind me, fastening his cufflinks. "You do not have to wear it," he said. "Mason told me to bring it. That is not a reason." "No, but Lily asked me to." He met my eyes in the mirror. "Are you afraid?" "Yes." The honesty surprised him. Of what? Not of Mason. Of what happens to Ellen, to Jonah, to the employees who did nothing wrong. Of becoming the face people remember instead of the facts they need to remember. Tom adjusted the collar at the back of my jacket. Then make the facts the loudest thing in the room. We arrived early. The ballroom smelled of coffee, polished wood, and floral arrangements large enough to conceal a radio operator. Aviation officers in dress uniforms gathered beneath chandeliers. Retired crew chiefs compared knees. Contractors moved through the crowd with badges, smiles, and careful eyes. Aegis had placed the Vigilant Demonstration Unit on a raised platform beside the stage. I recognized the sensor housing immediately. A red crescent had been printed on the display screen as a decorative icon. Noah's warning had become branding. Lily stood near the rear doors beside General Boone. She held the green canvas notebook inside a leather folder. Priya sat with Dana Cho at a table near the aisle. Agent Vega and another investigator remained against the far wall in civilian clothes. The pieces were in place. Only the contracting officer was missing. Mason entered 20 minutes later. He wore a tuxedo rather than a uniform. His face looked pale beneath the ballroom lights, but his posture remained polished. Ellen was not with him. He saw me and came directly across the room. "You wore it," he said. "You asked me to." He leaned closer. "Ellen stole from me. Ellen preserved evidence. You poisoned her against her husband. No, you did that without assistance." His jaw tightened. "Do you know what happens if this company falls? People lose pensions, suppliers close, families leave town, then tell the truth before someone flies with the lie." He looked toward Lily. "You gathered quite an audience. You invited them." For a moment, his confidence slipped. Then the master of ceremonies called guests to their seats, and Mason turned toward the stage as if it still belonged to him. Dinner passed in strained civility. A retired colonel told a story about learning to land in a crosswind. A chaplain offered a prayer for those still deployed. The band played softly. Servers moved plates beneath the careful hum of conversation. Mason barely ate. After dessert, the company president introduced him. Mason walked to the podium to applause that began warmly and ended uncertainly. He spoke for 15 minutes about innovation, readiness, and honoring the crews who trust their aircraft. He used the word trust 7 times. Then he demonstrated the system. A technician spun a test rig. 3 lines moved across the screen. The software produced a green pass within 4 minutes. The audience applauded again. I watched the housing temperature displayed in the corner. It was above the reliable threshold. Mason knew I saw it. He smiled from the stage. Before I close, he said, "I need to address an unfortunate distraction that has threatened this important program." The company president shifted in his chair. Mason continued, "A former Army employee has claimed our technology is unsafe and our work is stolen. That individual is a member of my family. She has used vague stories, redacted records, and the respect of honorable officers to create a legend around herself." Every face in the room turned toward me. Tom's hand found mine beneath the table. Mason lifted one of my redacted personnel pages. "Claire Mercer says she developed the Copper Ridge procedure. Yet her public record shows no such assignment. No citation names her. No patent names her. She has spent years allowing people to mistake administrative support for operational heroism." He looked directly at my ribbons. "Tell them the truth, Claire. Tell all these officers what you really did. Tell them you counted bolts in a warehouse while other people flew into danger." The room went still. My sister was not there to look away. My mother was not there to defend me. There was only Tom beside me, Lily near the rear doors, and a room full of people waiting to see whether I would turn pain into a performance. I stood. Mason's smile widened. I said the only accurate thing I could say. "My service record is not evidence that your system is safe." He spread his hands. "There it is. Another dodge." Then General Boone spoke from behind him. "Does the name Copper Ridge mean anything to you, Chief Mercer?" I turned toward him. "Yes, sir." "What was your call sign?" "Rook." Lily covered her mouth. Mason lowered his glass. Agent Vega and the investigator beside her stepped away from the wall. Boone walked toward the stage slowly, giving the room time to understand that he had not asked out of curiosity. "I commanded the aviation task force at Copper Ridge," he said. Chief Warrant Officer Claire Mercer led the safety cell that identified a hidden rotor defect under extreme heat conditions. Her decision to ground 2 aircraft saved at least 14 lives. Her warning was not administrative decoration. It was written because metal fails whether a schedule permits it or not. Mason gripped the podium. "General, with respect, this is a commercial dispute." "No," Boone said. "It became a safety matter the moment you removed the heat limitation. The first layer of the room changed then. People stopped looking at my ribbons and started looking at the green pass still glowing on the demonstration screen. Lily came forward. She placed the leather folder on the table beneath the stage and opened Noah's notebook. My father wrote the original field diagrams, she said. Mason Vale showed these pages to his engineers and claimed the work as his own. He omitted the page that says hot metal tells pretty lies. She turned the notebook toward the audience. The torn paper, the red chalk sketch, and Noah's underlined warning sat beneath the ballroom lights. Mason pointed at her. She violated a non-disclosure agreement. Dana Cho stood from her table. An employee cannot be lawfully silenced from reporting suspected fraud to the government, she said. Your agreement does not outrank federal law. That was the second layer. The company president rose halfway from his chair. Mason, step away from the podium. Mason ignored him. This is theater, he said. Old notebooks, family grudges, a retired general protecting one of his own. Priya stood next. Then explain my test data, she said. Her voice shook once and steadied. She held up a certified copy of the laboratory record. The system failed 3 hot cycle tests. I refused to change them. Mr. Vale ordered the failures marked as passes. When I objected, the company used my login and blamed me. Mason's eyes moved toward the exit. Agent Vega was already there. The contracting officer entered through the side door with 2 uniformed officials. He carried a red folder. Aegis Flight Systems has been issued an immediate suspension from the award process pending investigation, he announced. No contract will be made on the Vigilant system. Existing demonstration activity is stopped. The ballroom erupted in whispers. Mason stared at the red folder as if it contained a physical wound. You cannot do that based on accusations, he said. The contracting officer's voice remained calm. The government may suspend a contractor when credible evidence raises serious questions about honesty, responsibility, or safety. We do not have to wait for a funeral or a conviction. That was the third layer. Agent Vega stepped onto the stage. Mr. Vale, we have a forensic copy of the company laptop surrendered by your wife. We have the original audio in which you ordered the heat failures changed to passes. We have the file history showing your approval credentials. We have the revised board minutes and the earlier version you ordered removed. Mason's face lost all expression. For months, he had treated silence as empty space he could fill. Now every silence in the room belonged to the evidence. He looked at me. You did this, he said. I stood beside Tom, not triumphant, not smiling. No, Mason, you did this. I only stopped moving the warning out of your way. The company president sat down heavily. Several employees lowered their eyes. Others looked angry. A few looked relieved. Mason left the podium and came toward me. The investigators moved at once, but I raised one hand. He stopped several feet away. His voice dropped. You destroyed Ellen's life. Ellen appeared at the rear doors. No, she said. You used our life as collateral. Jonah stood beside her. Mason turned toward his son, and something in him finally broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. His shoulders simply fell, as if the invisible uniform he had worn for years had been removed. He had built the evening to prove I was small. Instead, his wife, his son, his employees, his investors, and the officers he wanted to impress had all watched the same thing happen. The truth had not made me larger. It had made him accurate. General Boone asked Lily to join him at the microphone. Then he invited me forward. I did not want applause. I wanted the demonstration unit unplugged. I wanted every aircraft protected. I wanted Noah's warning restored in letters nobody could mistake for decoration. But when Lily held her father's notebook against her chest and the first crew chief in the room stood, others followed. Pilots stood. Mechanics stood. Widows stood. Young officers stood beside retired ones. Tom stood before anyone else. The applause rose slowly, not for a legend, but for a warning that had survived the people who tried to erase it. At the height of that sound, I looked at the camera near the stage and thought of every quiet person who had ever been called weak because they refused to shout. If you have known someone like that, someone whose work was ignored until the truth could no longer be hidden, leave their name in the comments. Let this be the place where quiet service is remembered. I reached for Lily's hand. This belongs to your father, I told the room. The method was never mine alone. She shook her head. He wrote the rhythm, she said. You made them listen. Agent Vega did not arrest Mason in the ballroom. Real cases do not always provide the handcuffs people expect. She served him with documents, secured the company devices, and instructed him through counsel. The criminal process would take months. The administrative action was immediate. Aegis lost the award. The board removed Mason and 2 other executives. The company survived by selling a profitable civilian division, closing the lakefront headquarters, and cooperating with the investigation. Most employees kept their jobs. The people who warned the company were reinstated or compensated. Mason eventually pleaded guilty to making false statements and conspiring to defraud the government. He was sentenced to prison, ordered to pay restitution, and barred from federal contracting for years after his release. I was cleared of every conflict allegation. My supervisor apologized in private, and then, at my request, corrected the record in writing where every person who had seen me carry out that box could read it. Ellen sold the lake house before the bank could take it. She moved into a smaller home near my mother. Jonah stayed in college with scholarships and part-time work. He changed his major from business to mechanical engineering, though he said that decision had nothing to do with any of us. We allowed him the lie. Lily joined an Army research laboratory. Priya did too. Together, they helped develop a revised diagnostic standard that restored the full heat warning and required an independent audit trail for any changed test result. The red crescent remained, but no longer as a logo. It appeared beside one sentence: cool the housing. Test again. Do not trade time for truth. A year after the banquet, the Army dedicated a small training room to Noah Bell and the 4 others lost in the Copper Ridge crash. It was not a grand memorial. Noah would have disliked anything grand. The room contained a maintenance bench, a vibration rig, his green notebook beneath glass, and a piece of cardboard above the bench. 3 tones, 1 truth. Lily asked me to speak at the dedication. I said no twice. The 3rd time, Tom told her to stop asking and simply put my name on the program. He had learned a few command techniques over the years. The room was full when I arrived. My mother sat in the front row with Ellen. General Boone leaned on a cane near the wall. Priya stood beside a group of young engineers. Tom wore the same blue tie he had worn at the banquet. There was one empty chair at the end of the 2nd row. On it lay a letter from Mason. He had written it from prison to Lily, not to me. He apologized for using her father's work and for trying to make grief doubt itself. He did not ask forgiveness. He enclosed the documents transferring every bonus and stock payment he had received from the Vigilant Project into a restitution fund for aviation mechanic scholarships. The amount was smaller than the harm and larger than I expected. Lily read the letter privately. Then she placed it beneath the glass beside Noah's notebook. Not because Mason deserved a place beside Noah, she explained, but because future engineers should see both choices. The choice to tell the truth when it costs you, and the choice to hide it until the cost belongs to everyone else. That was the warm twist I had not expected. Mason's worst act would not be hidden. Neither would his first honest attempt to repair what could never be fully repaired. When I finally stood at the front of the room, I did not speak about classified missions or medals. I spoke about a crew chief who tapped every housing 3 times. I spoke about heat, patience, and the arrogance of believing a deadline can overrule physics. Then I looked at the young mechanics. Machines rarely fail without speaking first, I told them. People fail when they decide the warning is inconvenient. Afterward, my mother touched the glass above Noah's notebook. Ellen rested her head briefly on my shoulder. Tom found my hand. Lily climbed onto the maintenance platform and straightened the cardboard sign by less than an inch, the way her father might have. 3 images stayed with me. My sister turning the brass key over to the investigators. Noah's daughter opening the notebook beneath the ballroom lights. A row of young mechanics reading the warning Mason had tried to erase. For most of my life, I believed honor meant carrying silence without complaint. I still believe silence has its place. Some promises require it. Some missions depend on it. Some grief needs a quiet room before it can breathe. But silence is not the same as surrender. When a lie uses your silence to endanger other people, speaking is not pride, it is maintenance. You stop the machine, you mark the heat, you test again, and you do not let anyone trade time for truth.